The small town of Oakwood, Massachusetts, sat nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, its Victorian houses standing as silent witnesses to generations of history. In 1927, while the nation celebrated the Roaring Twenties with jazz and prosperity, Oakwood remained frozen in time, a place where family names carried weight and secrets were buried deeper than the town's ancient cemetery. The Blackwood estate stood at the edge of town, a massive structure of brick and wrought iron that loomed over the community like a watchful guardian. The family had been there since the town's founding in 1792, and their wealth from lumber and railroad investments had made them both respected and feared. Thomas Blackwood, at 14, was different from the other children in town. Pale and thin, with eyes that seemed too knowing for his age, he spent most days alone in the family library, poring over dusty volumes while other boys played baseball in the summer heat. His parents, Richard and Margaret Blackwood, were rarely seen in town except for church on Sundays, where they sat rigid in the front pew, never speaking to anyone but the pastor. "That boy ain't right," whispered Mrs. Peterson to her husband as they watched Thomas walk past their general store one autumn afternoon. "Never plays with others, never smiles. And those eyes, like he's looking right through you." Sheriff James Miller had noticed it too. A 30-year veteran of law enforcement, he'd seen his share of troubled souls. But something about the Blackwood boy made the hair on his neck stand up. "It's just how those old families are," he'd tell himself. "Too much marrying within the same circles." What no one in town knew was that Thomas had recently discovered a hidden compartment in his grandfather's desk. Inside lay a leather-bound journal dating back to 1856, filled with cryptic entries and a detailed family tree. For weeks, Thomas had been studying it, his young mind connecting dots that generations had worked to keep separate. On October 12, 1927, Thomas approached his father in his study, the journal clutched to his chest. "Father," he said, his voice unnaturally calm, "I know what our family has done." Richard Blackwood looked up from his papers, his face draining of color as he saw what his son was holding. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, rising from his chair. "Grandfather's desk," Thomas replied. "I know about the marriages. I know why mother looks so much like your sister. I know why I single quotes different." Richard lunged for the journal, but Thomas stepped back, his eyes cold. "I've made copies of the important pages," the boy said, "and I've figured out what needs to be done to fix it." That night, strange lights were seen in the windows of the Blackwood estate, and a servant reported hearing raised voices followed by an eerie silence. By morning, Richard Blackwood had summoned the family lawyer, and 3 telegrams were sent to distant relatives. Sheriff Miller, passing by on his morning rounds, noticed unusual activity at the estate, curtains drawn in the middle of the day, and the gardener digging what looked like a deep hole behind the rose garden. "Just putting in a new irrigation system, Sheriff," the man had said, not meeting Miller's eyes. What had begun that autumn day would soon cast a shadow over Oakwood that would last for generations. All because a 14-year-old boy had uncovered the terrible truth of his bloodline. The Blackwood family secret had remained buried for over 70 years, passed down only from father to eldest son upon reaching adulthood. Thomas, in his precocious curiosity, had broken this chain of secrecy far too early. Dr. Edwin Porter, the town physician who had delivered Thomas and treated the Blackwood family for decades, noticed the change in the household immediately. Summoned to the estate for what Margaret claimed was a persistent cough, he found the atmosphere thick with tension. "The boy seems troubled," Dr. Porter mentioned carefully as he packed his medical bag after examining Margaret. "Perhaps a consultation with a specialist in Boston might—" "Thomas is fine," Margaret snapped, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "He's simply at a difficult age." Dr. Porter had known Margaret since she arrived in Oakwood as a bride at 17. She'd been a quiet, delicate thing then, with the same haunting pale eyes as her husband. Now at 32, she looked a decade older, her face lined with worry. "As you wish," he replied, but made a note in his journal that evening about the strange bruising he'd noticed on Margaret's wrist. Meanwhile, Thomas had begun visiting the town library, requesting books on genetics and heredity, topics far beyond what a typical 14-year-old would study. Miss Eleanor Winters, the librarian who had worked there since before Thomas was born, was both impressed and disturbed by his intense focus. "He asked me if I knew about something called genetic degradation," she told her sister over dinner. "Said it was for a school project, but his eyes, they didn't blink once while he was speaking to me." The journal Thomas had discovered detailed a disturbing practice that had begun with his great-great-grandfather, Jonathan Blackwood, fearing the dilution of the family bloodline and fortune. Jonathan had arranged marriages between cousins and in 2 cases between uncle and niece once removed. The journal documented the unfortunate outcomes of some of these unions: stillbirths, children with peculiarities of mind and body, and a pattern of early deaths. Thomas's own parents were second cousins, though the town had never known this. Margaret had been brought from a distant branch of the family in Virginia, her maiden name changed to hide the connection. On October 17th, 5 days after confronting his father, Thomas approached Sheriff Miller as he left the barber shop. "Sheriff," he said, his voice steady despite his youth, "I believe a crime has been committed at my home." Miller, caught off guard by the direct approach, adjusted his hat. "What kind of crime, son?" "The worst kind," Thomas replied. "Against nature itself. I need to show you something, but not here. Can you meet me at the old boathouse by the lake tonight at 8? The sheriff agreed, more out of concern for the boy than belief in his claims. That evening, as dusk settled over Oakwood Lake, Miller approached the dilapidated boathouse where generations of town children had fished and swam during summer months. Thomas was already there, a leather satchel at his feet, and a look of grim determination on his young face. "I brought evidence," he said, reaching for the satchel. But before he could open it, a shot rang out across the lake. The bullet splintered the wooden post just inches from Thomas's head. Sheriff Miller reacted instantly, pushing the boy down behind an overturned rowboat and drawing his service revolver. "Stay down," he commanded, scanning the tree line across the narrow part of the lake. The fading light made it impossible to spot the shooter. Thomas, however, seemed almost eerily calm. "It's Uncle William," he said matter-of-factly. "Father must have told him I was going to expose everything." William Blackwood, Richard's younger brother, was rarely seen in Oakwood. He managed the family's business interests in Boston, returning only for holidays and funerals. Known for his hunting prowess and quick temper, he was not someone Sheriff Miller wanted to face in a shootout. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Miller said, planning their escape route. "There's nowhere safe in Oakwood for me now," Thomas replied, clutching his satchel. "But you need to see this first." He pulled out several folded papers, copies of the family tree he'd mentioned, along with pages from medical journals with sections circled in red ink. Most disturbing was a list of names. Blackwood children born over the past 70 years with dates of birth and death. Over half had died before reaching age 10, with causes ranging from heart failure to unknown malady. "My sister Elizabeth isn't away at school in Europe like they told everyone," Thomas whispered. "She began having seizures last year. They've got her locked in the East Wing. I've been sneaking her food when our parents are out." Miller felt sick. In his 30 years as sheriff, he'd turned a blind eye to many of the eccentricities of wealthy families like the Blackwoods, considering their privacy a right that came with their position. Now he wondered how many children had suffered while the town looked away. Another shot rang out, closer this time, splintering the boathouse window. "We're leaving." "Now," Miller decided, grabbing Thomas by the shoulder. "Stay low and run for my car when I tell you." They made it to the sheriff's Model T parked on the dirt road, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. As Miller sped toward town, Thomas looked back at the only home he'd ever known, his face a mask of determination rather than fear. "They'll kill me before they let me testify," he said simply. "Not on my watch," Miller replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The Blackwoods' influence extended to the state capital. Even the judge owed his position to their political connections. That night, Miller hid Thomas in the back room of the sheriff's office, then made a telephone call to an old friend at the Boston Bureau of Investigation. By morning, 2 agents had arrived in Oakwood, their black sedan raising eyebrows as it parked outside the town hall. Word spread quickly. By noon, Richard Blackwood and his lawyer had stormed into Miller's office, demanding the return of his disturbed and lying son. "Thomas has fabricated these stories for attention," Richard insisted, his lawyer nodding beside him. "He needs medical help, not federal intervention." Agent Phillips, a square-jawed man with skeptical eyes, studied the documents Thomas had provided. "These medical records appear authentic," he observed, "and the death certificates raise questions that deserve investigation." Richard's face contorted with rage. "This is a family matter. You have no jurisdiction here." "Kidnapping and child endangerment are federal crimes, Mr. Blackwood," the agent replied calmly. "And we've received telegraph confirmation that your daughter Elizabeth is not enrolled in any school in Europe as you've claimed." As they argued, no one noticed the telegram boy who delivered a message to the sheriff's office and then hurried directly to the Blackwood estate. By evening, the town was abuzz with rumors, and Dr. Porter had been summoned to examine Thomas, who remained in protective custody. "The boy is sound of mind," Porter confirmed to the agents, "and I'm ashamed to admit I've suspected irregularities in that family for years." At midnight, a fire broke out at the town hall records office, destroying decades of birth and death certificates. By morning, William Blackwood had disappeared, and Margaret was found unconscious in her bedroom, an empty bottle of laudanum on her nightstand. The Blackwood secrets were beginning to unravel, but the family's desperate efforts to maintain them were becoming increasingly dangerous. Elizabeth Blackwood hadn't seen sunlight in 14 months. At 16, she had once been considered the beauty of Oakwood. With her mother's delicate features and a musical talent that had townspeople predicting a bright future, now she existed in the shadows of the East Wing, her once graceful movements hampered by muscle contractions, her clear voice reduced to occasional mumbling. The seizures had begun shortly after her 16th birthday. At first, they were dismissed as female hysteria, treated with rest and tonics. But when she collapsed during Easter service, convulsing in the church aisle as horrified congregants looked on, even Richard Blackwood couldn't maintain the pretense of normalcy. Rather than seek proper medical treatment, the Blackwoods had Elizabeth declared emotionally unstable and sent away, supposedly to a finishing school in Switzerland. In reality, she never left the estate. A small suite of rooms in the unused East Wing became her prison, with only her mother and a trusted servant for company. Thomas had discovered her by accident 6 months earlier, hearing faint piano music while exploring the supposedly empty wing. Finding his sister, thin and pale but still recognizably Elizabeth, had been the first crack in the foundation of lies he'd been raised on. Now, with Thomas in protective custody and federal agents combing through family records, Elizabeth remained alone and unaware of the unfolding drama. The servant who normally attended her had fled after the fire at the town hall, leaving only Margaret to care for her. With Margaret hospitalized following her laudanum overdose, no one had visited the East Wing for 3 days. Agent Phillips, acting on Thomas's desperate pleas, obtained a warrant to search the entire Blackwood estate. Richard Blackwood, looking haggard and defeated, stood in the grand foyer as agents and local deputies spread throughout the mansion. "You're desecrating a private residence based on the fantasies of a disturbed child," Richard protested weakly. His usual commanding presence diminished. Sheriff Miller, who had once respected the man, could barely look at him. "Where's the key to the East Wing, Richard?" When Blackwood refused to answer, they broke down the heavy oak door that separated the main house from the abandoned wing. The smell hit them first, a sickening combination of unwashed body, spoiled food, and the medicinal odor of camphor and laudanum. They found Elizabeth in her bed, dehydrated and barely conscious, but alive. Dr. Porter was summoned immediately, while Sheriff Miller photographed the conditions: the barred windows, the locked medicine cabinet filled with sedatives, the journal where Margaret had documented Elizabeth's treatments in meticulous detail. "This is medical neglect of the highest order," Dr. Porter declared, his hands shaking with anger as he examined the girl. "She needs a hospital immediately." As Elizabeth was carefully moved to an ambulance, her eyes flickered open. Seeing Sheriff Miller, she grasped his hand with surprising strength. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "He's safe," Miller assured her.
Thank you.
"He's the one who told us where to find you." A ghost of a smile crossed her cracked lips before she slipped back into unconsciousness. That evening, as Elizabeth was transported to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, the agents made another discovery in Richard Blackwood's study: a hidden safe containing birth records of 3 other children, siblings of Thomas and Elizabeth, who had supposedly died in infancy. However, financial records indicated regular payments to a private facility in Connecticut until dates that suggested the children had lived for years, not days. Richard Blackwood was taken into custody, charged with child endangerment, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The town of Oakwood watched in stunned silence as the patriarch of their most prestigious family was led away in handcuffs. Thomas, temporarily placed with Dr. Porter's family, sat on the porch that night watching federal agents come and go from his childhood home. The 14-year-old who had brought down generations of secrets looked older than his years as he confided in Miller. "There are others," he said quietly, "cousins in Virginia and Philadelphia, all hidden away when they showed signs of what they call the family affliction." Miller nodded grimly. "The agents are already investigating. Your father's records have given them plenty to work with." Thomas looked down at his hands, the slightly elongated fingers, the unusual pallor that had always marked him as different. "It wasn't just vanity or greed," he said. "They believed they were special, superior, that keeping the bloodline pure would eventually create something perfect. Instead, they created suffering," Miller replied. As night fell over Oakwood, lights burned in windows that had been dark for years as agents continued their search of the estate. The town would never be the same, nor would the other communities, where Blackwood relatives had carried out similar practices. The 14-year-old who had dared to question his birthright had set in motion events that would eventually rescue dozens of hidden children across New England. Children sacrificed to a perverse family pride that had festered in darkness for generations. As federal investigators dug deeper into the Blackwood family affairs, They uncovered a network that stretched far beyond Oakwood. Through telegrams, telephone calls, and train journeys to distant relatives' homes, a disturbing pattern emerged. Agent Phillips, now leading what newspapers were calling the Blackwood investigation, set up a makeshift headquarters in Oakwood's small hotel. Maps covered the walls, with red pins marking Blackwood family properties and blue pins indicating suspected locations of hidden family members. "It's like a spider's web," he explained to Sheriff Miller, tracing lines between locations. Each branch of the family was responsible for hiding the unfortunate outcomes of their breeding experiments. Richard and Margaret's generation was the fourth to continue the practice. Thomas, still under Dr. Porter's care, provided crucial information. The journal he discovered contained coded references to family members across 6 states. With his help, agents were able to decipher location details that led to the discovery of 3 more hidden Blackwood children in a remote farmhouse in Vermont. "My grandfather's journal mentioned something called the Covenant," Thomas told the agents during one of their interviews. "A pact made in 1856 by the 5 Blackwood brothers to preserve what they called the purity of their exceptional bloodline. They believed our family possessed special qualities that would be diluted if we married outsiders." The Boston newspapers had picked up the story, running sensational headlines about aristocratic atrocities and blood crimes of the wealthy, while some details were exaggerated. The essential truth was shocking enough. A prominent American family had engaged in systematic inbreeding for generations, hiding the often devastating results from public view. Margaret Blackwood, recovered from her overdose but still frail, was permitted to see Thomas under supervision. The meeting, which took place in Dr. Porter's parlor, was tense and revealing. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice hollow. "Generations of sacrifice, all undone by a child who couldn't mind his place." Thomas regarded his mother steadily. "People suffered, Mother. Elizabeth suffered. The babies in the Connecticut facilities suffered. Was family pride worth all that pain?" Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "You don't understand. The Covenant wasn't just about pride. It was about protection. There are things in our bloodline that must be contained, controlled." "What things?" Agent Phillips asked sharply. Margaret fell silent, refusing to elaborate despite further questioning. Later that evening, Dr. Porter shared a disturbing observation with Sheriff Miller. "I've treated 3 generations of Blackwoods," he said, pouring himself a generous whiskey. "There's something unusual about their physiology. Their blood work shows anomalies I've never seen elsewhere. Higher red blood cell counts, unusual clotting factors." "What are you suggesting?" Miller asked. "Nothing supernatural," Porter clarified quickly. "But perhaps a rare genetic condition that they misinterpreted as special or superior. Something that, when concentrated through intermarriage, created both benefits and terrible costs." On November 2nd, 3 weeks after Thomas had first approached Sheriff Miller, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Alma Wilson, who had served as cook at the Blackwood estate for 27 years before retiring in 1923, came forward with a trunk full of personal diaries. "I kept records of everything," the elderly woman told Agent Phillips. "The births that never made it into town records, the children who died but were taken away in the night, the special diets, the unusual medicines. I knew it wasn't right, but who would believe a colored cook over the Blackwoods?" Her diaries provided the final pieces of evidence needed to bring charges against 12 family members across New England. They also confirmed Dr. Porter's suspicions about the Blackwoods' unusual physiology. "The oldest ones live long beyond what's natural," one entry read. "Old Jonathan was near 100 when he finally passed, though he looked no more than 70. But the children of close marriages often come with terrible costs, minds that never develop right, bodies that turn against themselves." As federal agents prepared to make coordinated arrests across multiple states, Thomas made a request to visit the family crypt in Oakwood Cemetery. Accompanied by Sheriff Miller and Agent Phillips, he walked among the ornate headstones of his ancestors. "There are more names here than there should be," he observed, pointing to a section of small markers. "It's empty graves for the ones they sent away. They still gave them Blackwood stones, even as they erased them from the family." Standing in that cemetery, surrounded by the names of 7 generations of Blackwoods, Thomas looked both younger than his 14 years and impossibly old. "I'm the last one now," he said quietly. "The last who knows the full truth. Elizabeth may recover her health, but not her memories. The laudanum saw to that." "What will you do?" Miller asked. Thomas gazed at the family mausoleum, its marble facade gleaming coldly in the November sunlight. "Break the covenant," he replied. "End it all." The arrests began at dawn on November 7, 1927. In coordinated raids across New England, federal agents and local law enforcement descended upon Blackwood properties, taking family members into custody on charges ranging from child endangerment to fraud and conspiracy. In Boston, William Blackwood was apprehended as he attempted to board a ship bound for Europe. In Philadelphia, cousins Edward and Josephine Blackwood were arrested at their mansion on the Main Line. In total, 17 adult Blackwoods were taken into custody that day. More shocking to the public were the 13 Blackwood children discovered hidden in various locations, remote farms, private sanatoriums, and in 3 cases, attic rooms of family estates. Ranging in age from 4 to 22, most showed signs of neglect and many exhibited the physical and neurological symptoms of what doctors were now calling Blackwood syndrome, the result of generations of inbreeding. The press descended upon Oakwood, transforming the sleepy town into the epicenter of what one newspaper called the American House of Usher. Reporters camped outside the Blackwood estate, photographed the town square, and offered local residents handsome sums for any stories about the mysterious family. Thomas, still under the protection of Dr. Porter, and now also guarded by federal agents, watched the unfolding spectacle with a detachment that concerned his caretakers. "He barely sleeps, Doctor," Porter confided to Agent Phillips. "When he does, he has nightmares that leave him screaming about blood and covenants." Elizabeth's condition had stabilized at Massachusetts General Hospital. Freed from the constant sedation she'd endured in the East Wing, she was beginning to speak coherently again, though her memories of the past year remained fragmented. Thomas was permitted to visit her twice, brief reunions that left both siblings emotionally drained. On November 15th, as the first snowfall of the season dusted Oakwood, Richard Blackwood was found dead in his cell at the county jail. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but rumors spread that he had somehow obtained poison, choosing death over the public humiliation of a trial. Margaret, awaiting trial under house arrest at her sister's home in Cambridge, responded to the news with eerie calm. "He was always the weakest of us," she told her court-appointed attorney, "the least committed to the covenant." The investigation continued to uncover disturbing details. Financial records revealed that the Blackwood fortune had been built not only on legitimate business interests, but also on a complex insurance fraud scheme. For generations, the family had taken out policies on children they knew would likely develop health problems, collecting substantial sums upon their deaths or institutionalization. More disturbing were the medical records discovered in a hidden room beneath the Blackwood estate's library. Dating back to 1862, these journals documented a systematic attempt to breed for specific traits, longevity, intelligence, and what was described as heightened sensory acuity, while working to eliminate the unfortunate byproducts of their genetic experiments. On December 3rd, Thomas testified before a federal grand jury in Boston, becoming the key witness in what would eventually become United States v. Blackwood et al. His testimony, delivered with a composure that belied his 14 years, provided the final evidence needed to indict the remaining adult Blackwoods. They believed they were creating something superior, he told the jury. Instead, they created monsters, not the children who suffered from their experiments, but themselves. They became monsters willing to sacrifice their own blood for vanity and greed. The grand jury proceedings were closed to the press, but details inevitably leaked. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story describing Thomas as the boy who destroyed his bloodline to save its victims. Other papers were less charitable, questioning whether Thomas himself might carry the tainted Blackwood blood and suggesting he be studied by medical experts. Dr. Porter, who had become fiercely protective of his young charge, refused all requests for medical examinations beyond those necessary for Thomas's health. "He's a child who has lost everything," he told reporters who gathered outside his home, "not a specimen to be studied." As Christmas approached, Oakwood attempted to return to normal, though the shadow of the Blackwood scandal hung over the town like the dark winter clouds. The estate stood empty, its contents cataloged by federal agents and its future uncertain. The town council debated whether to demolish the structure or preserve it, with some arguing it should stand as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and secrecy. Thomas, who would eventually be placed with distant relatives untouched by the scandal, spent his last night in Oakwood visiting the town cemetery one final time. Sheriff Miller, who had developed a paternal affection for the boy, accompanied him. Standing before the Blackwood mausoleum, Thomas placed a single white rose on the steps. "Not for them," he explained to Miller's questioning look. "For the ones who never had a chance. The sacrifices to the covenant." As they turned to leave, Thomas paused, looking back at the family crypt with its imposing doors and the Blackwood crest carved in marble above them. "Do you think blood remembers?" he asked suddenly, "even when we try to forget it?" Miller had no answer, but as they walked through the snow-covered graves, he noticed how Thomas's eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that seemed almost luminous. a final reminder of the unusual Blackwood physiology that had driven a family to such desperate measures to preserve it. The United States v. Blackwood et al. The trial began in February 1928, transforming the federal courthouse in Boston into a theater of American Gothic horror. News cameras flashed as the remaining Blackwood defendants were led up the courthouse steps, their once proud faces now haggard with confinement and exposure. Margaret Blackwood, dressed in severe black as if already mourning the family's downfall, became the central figure of public fascination. Unlike her co-defendants, who kept their eyes downcast, Margaret stared directly at the cameras, her unusual pale eyes seeming to challenge the world's judgment. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Donovan, laid out a case that shocked even those who had followed the newspaper accounts. Using Thomas's testimony, Alma Wilson's diaries, and the medical records discovered at the estate, they painted a picture of a family that had engaged in a multi-generational conspiracy to perpetuate their bloodline at any cost. For over 70 years, Donovan told the packed courtroom, the Blackwood family has engaged in a pattern of behavior that can only be described as monstrous. They have deliberately intermarried close relatives, fully aware of the potential consequences for their offspring. When those consequences manifested, as they inevitably did, they hid away the resulting children, denying them proper care and, in many cases, basic human dignity. The defense attempted to portray the Blackwoods as victims of their own ignorance, arguing that they had genuinely believed they were preserving important genetic traits. They brought in experts on eugenics, still a respected field in 1928, to testify that the Blackwoods' goals, if not their methods, aligned with contemporary scientific thinking. This strategy backfired dramatically when the prosecution introduced the detailed Blackwood medical records, which clearly showed they had documented and understood the devastating effects of their breeding program as early as 1872, yet continued the practice regardless. Thomas testified for 3 days, his clear, unwavering account of life inside the Blackwood estate drawing tears from jurors and spectators alike. He described discovering his sister in the East Wing, finding the hidden journals, and his gradual realization of the truth behind his family's unusual physical characteristics and the many cousins who disappeared after showing signs of illness. Most devastating was his description of the night he confronted his father with the evidence. He didn't deny it, Thomas testified. He told me it was my birthright to understand the covenant, but that I was too young. He said that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the greater good of the bloodline. Margaret Blackwood, who had remained stoic throughout most of the proceedings, finally broke her silence during cross-examination. When asked if she felt remorse for her treatment of Elizabeth and the other hidden children, she looked directly at Thomas in the witness stand. You speak of cruelty, she said, but you don't understand preservation. Our family carries something precious, something that must continue. Yes, there were sacrifices. There are always sacrifices for greatness. Do you consider what happened to Elizabeth a sacrifice for greatness? Donovan asked. Margaret's gaze never left Thomas. Elizabeth was weak. The covenant demands strength. The courtroom erupted at this admission, forcing the judge to call for order. Thomas, for his part, met his mother's stare without flinching, though Dr. Porter, sitting beside him, noticed the boy's hands trembling beneath the table. As the trial entered its third week, medical testimony became the focus. Dr. Porter and specialists from Massachusetts General Hospital presented their findings on what they now termed Blackwood familial disorder, a complex of genetic anomalies resulting from generations of inbreeding. The subjects exhibit unusual longevity, enhanced night vision, and elevated red blood cell counts, Dr. Howard Reynolds of Harvard Medical School testified. However, these apparent advantages come with catastrophic costs in later generations: neurological deterioration, immune system dysfunction, and in approximately 40% of cases, a distinctive form of progressive epilepsy. The prosecution connected these findings to the Blackwood Covenant, arguing that the family had misinterpreted these genetic anomalies as signs of superiority, driving their determination to keep their bloodline pure despite the obvious harm to their descendants. On March 17th, after 5 weeks of testimony, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on all counts for Margaret and 14 other adult Blackwoods. The judge, citing the unprecedented depravity of their crimes, handed down the maximum sentences available, lengthy prison terms that ensured most would never return to freedom. Margaret Blackwood, sentenced to 30 years, showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Her final words in court, spoken as she was led away, were directed at Thomas. "Blood will tell, my son. In the end, blood always tells." The media coverage, which had been intense throughout, reached a crescendo with the verdicts. The case became a national sensation, inspiring debate about eugenics, family authority, and the power of wealth to conceal criminality. Several states introduced legislation specifically criminalizing inbreeding practices, citing the Blackwood case as evidence of the need for such laws. For Thomas, the end of the trial brought not closure but a new chapter of uncertainty. With both parents effectively removed from his life and the family fortune frozen in legal proceedings, his future hung in the balance. The court appointed a guardian, a distant maternal cousin from Chicago who had no connection to the Blackwood intermarriage practices. As Thomas prepared to leave Oakwood, perhaps forever, Sheriff Miller found him at the lake, skipping stones across the still cold water. "You did the right thing," Miller told him. "No matter what happens next, remember that." Thomas watched as a stone skipped 5 times before sinking. "I know," he said quietly, "but I can't help wondering. What part of them is still in me?" Spring arrived in Oakwood with unusual warmth, as if nature itself was attempting to thaw the chill left by the Blackwood scandal. The estate, which had stood empty through the winter months, was now being systematically dismantled. Federal agents had confiscated most of the contents for evidence, while items of historical value were claimed by museums. What remained would be auctioned, with proceeds held in trust for the victims of the Blackwood conspiracy. Thomas, now living with his cousin Robert Campbell in Chicago, followed these developments through letters from Sheriff Miller and newspaper clippings sent by Dr. Porter. His new life was deliberately ordinary: attendance at a private school where no one knew his history, regular medical checkups with specialists monitoring for signs of the Blackwood condition, and weekly sessions with a psychiatrist who specialized in childhood trauma. Elizabeth had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility in western Massachusetts, where she was making slow but steady progress. Her seizures, freed from the exacerbating effects of overmedication, had decreased in frequency. Though her memories remained fragmented, she had begun to play the piano again, simple melodies at first, but growing more complex as her coordination improved. The other rescued Blackwood children faced varied paths to recovery. The youngest adapted most quickly to their new circumstances, placed with foster families or distant relatives untouched by the scandal. The older ones, particularly those who had spent years in isolation, struggled more significantly with the transition to normal life. In April 1928, the first academic paper on Blackwood familial disorder was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, describing the unusual genetic characteristics found in the family bloodline. The authors theorized that an ancestor had developed a beneficial mutation that, in single dose, provided advantages in longevity and certain physical capabilities. When concentrated through intermarriage, however, these same genes produced devastating neurological effects. Thomas received a copy of the paper from Dr. Porter, along with a note cautioning him not to obsess over its contents. "You are more than your genes," the doctor wrote. "Remember that science is still in its infancy regarding heredity. What matters most is the life you choose to live from here." On his 10th birthday in May, Thomas received an unexpected letter, forwarded through his lawyer. It had been written by Margaret from the Women's Federal Penitentiary in West Virginia, where she was serving her sentence. "My dearest son," it began, the familiar elegant handwriting bringing an involuntary shiver. "By now you believe you have escaped the covenant, that you have destroyed what generations built. Perhaps in this life you have. But blood has patience that transcends a single lifetime. What flows in your veins will not be denied forever. The Blackwood legacy will find its way back to the surface, if not in you, then in your children, or their children." And the letter continued for several pages, alternating between maternal affection and disturbing allusions to the special nature of Blackwood blood. Thomas read it once, then burned it in the fireplace of his cousin's Chicago apartment, watching the pages curl and blacken with an expression that mixed fear and resolution. That summer, Thomas received news that the Blackwood estate had been sold to the state of Massachusetts, with plans to convert it into a medical research facility focused on rare genetic disorders. The irony was not lost on him. The house that had hidden so much medical suffering would now be dedicated to alleviating it. In Chicago, Thomas struggled to adapt to his new identity. Cousin Robert, a bachelor professor of linguistics at the University of Chicago, provided a stable, if somewhat austere, home. Having never married or had children of his own, Robert approached guardianship with academic diligence rather than paternal warmth. Still, he respected Thomas's privacy and never pressed him to discuss the Blackwood case unless Thomas initiated the conversation. "You're more Campbell than Blackwood anyway," Robert assured him one evening as they sat in his book-lined study. "Your grandmother on your mother's side was my aunt, and the Campbells have always been sound in mind and body. Excellent scholars, too, which explains your academic aptitude." Thomas nodded, not mentioning that he had discovered the Campbell connection in the family tree. They, too, were distant Blackwood relatives, though far enough removed to avoid the genetic pitfalls of closer intermarriage. The Covenant's reach had been extensive, with branches extending into many supposedly unrelated families. In August, a package arrived from Sheriff Miller containing newspaper clippings about the auction of Blackwood possessions. Included was a small wooden box with a note. Found this hidden in the library floorboards. Thought you should have it rather than some collector. JM inside lay a silver pocket watch bearing the Blackwood crest, dating from the 1850s. Thomas recognized it from portraits of his great-grandfather Jonathan, the architect of the Covenant. He almost threw it away, but something stopped him. Perhaps the same curiosity that had led him to discover the family's secrets in the first place. Instead, he locked it in a desk drawer, telling himself it would serve as a reminder of what happened when pride and fear overcame humanity. As summer faded into fall, Thomas received word that Elizabeth had requested to see him. His cousin Robert, hesitant at first, eventually agreed to accompany him to Massachusetts for the reunion. The rehabilitation center was nothing like the sterile institutions Thomas had feared. Set on expansive grounds with gardens and walking paths, it resembled a country estate more than a hospital. Elizabeth, now 17, waited for them in a sunlit sitting room, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that momentarily reminded Thomas of their mother. "Tommy," she said, using the childhood nickname she alone had been allowed to use. "You look different." "So do you," he replied, noting with relief that her eyes were clear, her movements more fluid than when he had last seen her during the trial. Their conversation was awkward at first, circling around neutral topics: the weather, Elizabeth's piano progress, Thomas's new school. Robert and a staff psychologist sat nearby, monitoring the interaction but allowing the siblings their privacy. Finally, Elizabeth addressed what hung unspoken between them. "I remember bits and pieces now," she said quietly. "The East Wing. Mother's treatments. But there are still holes. Maybe that's for the best," Thomas suggested. Elizabeth shook her head. "I need to know who I am. What I am." She looked directly at him then, her pale eyes, the distinctive Blackwood eyes, searching his face. "Dr. Winters says the condition is manageable with the right care. That I might even live a normal life eventually." "You will," Thomas assured her, taking her hand. "We both will. But we'll always be Blackwoods," she whispered, "no matter what names we use or where we go. That blood is still there." The visit ended with a fragile promise to write regularly and perhaps meet again at Christmas. As Thomas and Robert prepared to leave, Elizabeth pressed something into her brother's hand, a folded piece of sheet music she had composed. "I've titled it Covenant's End," she told him with a faint smile. "I thought it fitting." On the train back to Chicago, Robert fell asleep while Thomas stared out the window at the passing landscape, thinking about blood and legacy, about the weight of the past and the possibility of future generations. He was only 15, but already he carried decisions no child should have to make. "Will you have children someday?" Dr. Reynolds had asked during his last medical examination, his tone carefully professional despite the loaded question. "With your knowledge of the family condition, you could make informed choices. Take precautions." Thomas hadn't answered then. The truth was, he didn't know. The idea of continuing any part of the Blackwood line filled him with dread. Yet the thought of being the final link, of ending a bloodline that stretched back centuries, carried its own terrible weight. As fall deepened into winter, Thomas found himself drawn to medical textbooks in his cousin's library, studying genetics and heredity with the same intensity he had once applied to the Blackwood journals. If knowledge had been his weapon against the family's secrets, perhaps it could also be his shield against their legacy in his own body. In December, just before Christmas, he received a telegram from Dr. Porter. "Margaret Blackwood dead. Stop apparent suicide. Stop details by letter stop." The promised letter arrived 3 days later, explaining that his mother had somehow obtained a sharp object and opened her wrists in her cell. She had left a note, which the prison authorities had forwarded to Dr. Porter, given its disturbing content. "The covenant transcends death," Margaret had written. "What sleeps in our blood will awaken again. I go to join those who understand the true purpose of our line. Thomas will remember in time. Blood will call to blood." Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others he had collected about the case, his own archive of the Blackwood tragedy. That night he dreamed of the estate, of hidden rooms and whispered secrets, of Elizabeth playing piano while shadows gathered in the corners. He woke gasping, his heart racing, the distinctive Blackwood eyes staring back at him from the mirror across his bedroom. Just a dream, he told himself. The past is gone. But as he lay awake until dawn, Thomas wondered if Margaret had been right about one thing. That blood had a patience that transcended a single lifetime. He was 15 years old, and he had destroyed generations of his family's dark legacy. Yet the blood of those generations still flowed in his veins, carrying secrets his science books couldn't yet explain. The question that would haunt him in the years to come was not what he had uncovered about his family's past, but what that past might yet reveal in his own future. 5 years passed. Thomas Blackwood, now legally Thomas Campbell, had grown into a young man of 20. His lanky teenage frame filled out, his features settled into the distinctive Blackwood handsomeness that had marked generations of his family. Only the haunted look in his unusual eyes suggested the weight he carried. In 1932, as the Great Depression gripped America, Thomas entered Harvard Medical School, his tuition paid from a trust established with his portion of the recovered Blackwood assets. His academic record was exemplary, his focus intense, particularly in the emerging field of genetics. Professors noted both his brilliance and his unusual interest in hereditary disorders. Though none connected the quiet, serious student with the sensational Blackwood case of years earlier. The scandal, like many others, had faded from public memory as economic hardship and global instability claimed national attention. Elizabeth, now 22, had made remarkable progress. Though she still experienced occasional seizures, careful medication management had brought them largely under control. She lived in a small apartment in Boston, supporting herself by giving piano lessons and composing music for local theater productions. The siblings met monthly for Sunday dinner, carefully building a relationship independent of their shared trauma. "I've been invited to perform in New York," Elizabeth told Thomas during one such dinner in the fall of 1932. "A small recital hall, nothing grand. But it's a start." "That's wonderful," Thomas replied, genuinely pleased at her growing independence. Robert would say the Campbell musical talent is finally showing through. It had become their private joke, attributing any positive quality to their Campbell ancestry rather than the Blackwood line. A small rebellion against the determinism their parents had embraced. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said, her tone turning serious, "about whether I should ever marry." Thomas set down his fork, immediately understanding the implication. The medical papers on Blackwood familial disorder had been clear about its heritability. Any children Elizabeth might have would carry at least some genetic markers of the condition with unknown consequences. "What does Dr. Winters say?" he asked carefully. "That it's my choice. That science is advancing rapidly, and by the time I might have children, there could be better treatments, better understanding." She smiled faintly. He also suggested I should be exceedingly careful about whom I marry, someone with no possible connection to our extended family tree. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Thomas remained preoccupied. His own medical studies had convinced him that the Blackwood condition was more complex than initially theorized, not simply a case of recessive genes concentrated through inbreeding, but something rarer, perhaps a unique mutation that affected multiple systems in ways that contemporary science couldn't fully explain. That winter, Thomas received an unexpected letter from Alma Wilson, the former Blackwood cook whose diaries had been crucial to the prosecution's case. Now in her 70s and living with her daughter in Harlem, she wrote that she had been troubled by dreams and felt compelled to reach out. "There are things I didn't tell the federal men," her spidery handwriting confessed. "Things about your great-grandfather Jonathan that seemed too fantastic to be believed. How he came back from the Civil War changed, not wounded in body but different. He'd been captured, you see, held in a Confederate prison camp in Georgia where terrible experiments were conducted. When he returned, he began the covenant, saying he'd learned secrets of blood that could make the family stronger. Special." Thomas might have dismissed this as the fanciful recollections of an elderly woman, except that it aligned with gaps in the family records. Jonathan Blackwood's Civil War service had been documented, including his capture in 1863. But details of his imprisonment and eventual return were conspicuously absent from both family and military archives. After consulting with Robert, Thomas arranged to visit Alma in New York. The elderly woman received him in her daughter's modest apartment, her mind still sharp despite her frail body. "I shouldn't have kept silent," she told him, gripping his hand with surprising strength. But who would believe in old colored woman stories about blood experiments and Confederate doctors obsessed with creating superior soldiers? It sounded like ghost stories, not evidence. According to Alma, Jonathan had spoken of a Dr. Aurelius Blackwood, no relation, who had conducted experiments on prisoners at the Georgia camp, testing theories about blood transfusions and their effects on human capabilities. Most subjects died, but Jonathan had survived, and upon returning home began keeping detailed journals about changes he observed in himself, enhanced night vision, unusual resilience to illness, and eventually a longevity that exceeded normal human expectations. He believed the doctor had unlocked something special in his blood, Alma explained, something that could be strengthened if kept pure, undiluted by outside bloodlines. That's when he began arranging marriages within the family, convincing his brothers to join what he called the sacred covenant of blood. Thomas listened with growing unease, recognizing elements that aligned with the medical findings, the unusual longevity, the enhanced physical capabilities that came at terrible neurological cost when concentrated through intermarriage. Did he ever mention where this Dr. Blackwood came from? His background, Thomas asked. Alma shook her head. Only that he spoke with a strange accent, not southern, not northern either. Foreign, but not like any foreigner I ever heard. And he was obsessed with old books, ancient medical texts. Jonathan once said the doctor claimed to have rediscovered secrets known to the old physicians of Eastern Europe. Thomas returned to Boston with more questions than answers, but also with a growing determination. If the Blackwood condition had indeed originated with experimental transfusions during the Civil War, perhaps the key to understanding it and potentially addressing its negative effects lay in that history. As 1932 gave way to 1933, Thomas divided his time between his medical studies and what he now thought of as his true education, tracing the origins of the Blackwood blood anomaly. He corresponded with military historians, requested records from Georgia archives, and even contacted several elderly Confederate veterans who might have heard of Dr. Aurelius Blackwood. Most leads proved fruitless, but in March 1933, Thomas received a response from the curator of a small medical museum in Atlanta. The museum had recently acquired a collection of papers from a former Confederate surgeon, including references to a visiting European doctor who had conducted controversial experiments at several prison camps. While not mentioned by name in these papers, the curator wrote, "This individual appears to match the description of your Dr. Blackwood." Of particular interest might be the reference to his unorthodox transfusion techniques and his belief that certain blood types carried what he termed ancestral memories and capabilities. The curator included copies of several pages from the papers, the faded handwriting describing experiments that would have been considered war crimes by modern standards. Thomas read them with a mixture of horror and scientific fascination, recognizing descriptions of symptoms similar to those documented in the Blackwood medical records generations later. In April, Thomas shared his findings with Elizabeth during their monthly dinner. She listened intently, her face paling at the implications. "So our family's special blood wasn't special at all," she said finally. "Just the result of some mad doctor's experiments on a prisoner of war." "It appears so," Thomas agreed, though the exact nature of what was done to great-grandfather Jonathan remains unclear. The transfusion techniques described are unlike anything in modern medical literature. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing patterns on the tablecloth with her finger. "Does it change anything?" she asked finally, knowing where it came from. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Perhaps not for the past, but for the future, our future, I think it might. If we understand the origin, we might better predict the expression of these traits in future generations." "You mean in our children?" Elizabeth said softly. "If we choose to have them, yes." The siblings fell silent, each contemplating the inheritance that flowed in their veins, not the noble, superior bloodline their parents had claimed, but the legacy of wartime experimentation, preserved and concentrated through generations of misguided breeding. The covenant had been based on a lie, yet its consequences were undeniably real. As they parted that evening, Elizabeth surprised Thomas by hugging him tightly. "Or more than our blood," she whispered. "Mother never understood that. Father never understood that, but we do." Thomas nodded, returning her embrace. "We do." That night, alone in his small apartment near the medical school, Thomas unlocked the desk drawer where he kept the silver pocket watch that had belonged to Jonathan Blackwood. He had never wound it, never worn it, keeping it only as a reminder of the past he had escaped. Now, with newfound knowledge about its original owner, Thomas examined the watch more carefully. The Blackwood crest on its cover, a raven holding a drop of blood in its beak, seemed different somehow, less a symbol of family pride and more a warning from the past. On impulse, he pressed the hidden catch that opened the watch's secret compartment, a feature he had discovered years earlier but never explored. Inside, he found a tightly folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Carefully unfolding it, he discovered a faded diagram of what appeared to be a human circulatory system, annotated in a spidery hand he didn't recognize. At the bottom was a single line of text in what looked like Latin, followed by initials, A.B. The Blackwood blood mystery had deeper roots than Thomas had imagined, extending beyond American shores and perhaps further back in time than the Civil War. As he carefully refolded the diagram and returned it to its hiding place, Thomas realized that his journey to understand his inheritance and to decide what to do with it was far from over. October 1937. A decade had passed since Thomas Blackwood, at 14, had exposed the dark secrets of his family. Now 24, Dr. Thomas Campbell stood before a classroom at Harvard Medical School, concluding his guest lecture on rare genetic disorders. The interplay between heredity and environment remains one of medicine's greatest frontiers, he told the assembled students. What we inherit biologically is only part of our story. What we do with that inheritance, how we understand it, manage it, and sometimes transcend it, that is the true measure of human potential. The lecture had been well received, establishing Thomas as a rising voice in the field of medical genetics. Few in the audience knew that his insights were drawn not just from academic study but from intimate personal experience. His research into what he now called Compound X syndrome, never publicly linked to the Blackwood case, had become his life's work. After the lecture, Thomas met Elizabeth at the train station. Now 27 and a respected composer whose work had been performed by orchestras in Boston and New York. She maintained the delicate beauty characteristic of the Blackwood women, though with a vitality their mother had never possessed. "How was Vienna?" Thomas asked as they settled into a quiet corner of the station restaurant. Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "Extraordinary. The medical treatments there are years ahead of what we have here, especially for neurological conditions." She lowered her voice. "Dr. Hoffman believes they've identified the specific protein anomaly responsible for my seizures. He's developing a targeted treatment that could eliminate them entirely." Thomas nodded, encouraged but cautious. "That's remarkable progress. Did you tell him about the family history?" "As much as seemed relevant," Elizabeth replied, without names or the more
sensation
details. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Winters, Elizabeth's closest friend and the daughter of her former doctor. At 25, Sarah was completing her Ph.D. in music theory at Radcliffe, having bonded with Elizabeth over their shared passion for composition. The two women had grown increasingly inseparable over the past 2 years, sharing an apartment in Cambridge and collaborating on musical projects. Thomas watched their interaction with quiet satisfaction. Sarah's presence in Elizabeth's life had brought a stability and joy he had once feared his sister might never experience, though never spoken of directly. Thomas understood the nature of their relationship extended beyond friendship, a private happiness in an era that would not have understood or accepted it. "Sarah's been invited to present her research in London next spring," Elizabeth announced. "We're thinking of making it an extended trip. London, Paris, perhaps back to Vienna." "That's wonderful news," Thomas replied sincerely. "You both deserve the recognition." As they dined, the conversation turned to Thomas's research. The previous year, he had established a small private laboratory using funds from his portion of the Blackwood estate. There, away from institutional oversight, he conducted his most sensitive research into the blood anomaly that had shaped his family's destiny. "I've made a breakthrough," he told them quietly, using samples from Elizabeth and myself. "Compared against historical records from the Blackwood Medical Archives, I've isolated what appears to be the key compound. It's unlike anything in the medical literature, almost as if ... Gov will quote, "As if what?" Sarah asked, intrigued. Thomas hesitated. "As if it's not entirely natural. The molecular structure suggests some form of artificial modification, though that should have been impossible given the medical technology of the 1860s, unless Dr. Aurelius Blackwood had knowledge beyond his time," Elizabeth suggested, "or access to techniques lost to history." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've been researching his background more thoroughly. There are references to a physician with a similar name in Eastern European medical journals from the 1840s, particularly in regions of what is now Romania and Hungary. The descriptions mention revolutionary blood studies and rejuvenation techniques that were dismissed by mainstream medicine as either fraudulent or dangerously unethical. The implications hung silently at the table. The Blackwood blood anomaly, the supposed superiority that had driven generations of inbreeding, might have origins even more disturbing than wartime experimentation. "What will you do with this knowledge?" Sarah asked finally. "Continue researching cautiously," Thomas replied. "The compound has remarkable properties that could revolutionize treatments for blood disorders, perhaps even aging itself. But its side effects, especially when concentrated ... quotes like in families who intermarry," Elizabeth supplied. "Exactly. The neurological damage we've seen in the Blackwood line suggests the compound becomes toxic when too concentrated in the bloodstream. But in diluted form, properly administered, it could heal rather than harm," Sarah concluded. Thomas nodded. "That's my hope." As evening fell, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Sarah's students, Elizabeth's latest composition. Thomas's recent correspondence with Dr. Porter, now retired in Florida, but still keenly interested in the siblings' progress. Walking them to their apartment later, Thomas felt a sense of cautious optimism he had rarely experienced in the decades since dismantling his family's dark legacy. The Blackwood name was fading from public memory, the estate now fully converted to a research hospital specializing in rare genetic disorders. The covenant had been broken, its participants either dead or imprisoned. Yet the Blackwood inheritance lived on, not just in the unusual blood that flowed through Thomas and Elizabeth's veins, but in their determination to transform that inheritance from curse to blessing. Thomas's research, conducted with meticulous care and ethical oversight self-imposed because of his family history, showed promise of medical applications that could benefit humanity, rather than serve the twisted vision of superiority that had driven the covenant. At Elizabeth's apartment, Thomas bid the women goodnight, promising to meet again before they departed for Europe. As he turned to leave, Elizabeth caught his arm. "Tommy," she said softly, using the childhood name she alone still used, "are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. "Happy? I'm content with my work, with the progress we've made." "That's not what I asked," she persisted. "Mother and father were never happy, not truly. They were driven, obsessed, but never at peace. I don't want that for you." Thomas considered his sister's concern. His life was indeed solitary, devoted to research, to unraveling the Blackwood mystery, to ensuring the family's dark practices never resumed. He had never married, never even formed serious romantic attachments, partly from caution about passing on the Blackwood traits, partly from the emotional walls he had built during his youth. "I'm not unhappy," he said finally, "and I'm nothing like them. My work is about healing, not power or preservation of some imagined superiority." Elizabeth seemed unconvinced but didn't press further. "Just remember, you deserve a life beyond the legacy," she said. "We both do." Later that night, in his small house on the outskirts of Cambridge, Thomas sat at his desk, reviewing his latest research notes. The silver pocket watch that had belonged to Jonathan Blackwood lay open beside them, the hidden diagram now carefully preserved between glass plates for protection. The Latin phrase at the bottom of the diagram, "sanguis vita est," sed memoria sanguinis aeterna, had been translated by a colleague as "blood is life, but the memory of blood is eternal." The cryptic words seemed to take on new meaning as Thomas's research progressed, suggesting that blood carried more than just genetic material, that it somehow preserved experiences, capabilities, perhaps even fragments of consciousness across generations. It was a disturbing thought, one that edged uncomfortably close to the mystical beliefs that had driven the covenant. Yet Thomas could not dismiss the mounting evidence that the compound in Blackwood blood had properties beyond current scientific understanding. As midnight approached, Thomas put away his notes and prepared for bed. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection showed the unmistakable Blackwood features, the angular face, the unusual eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond their physical structure. At 24, he looked remarkably like the portraits of Jonathan Blackwood at a similar age. "Blood is life," he murmured to his reflection. "But we are more than our blood." The Blackwood legacy continued, transformed but unbroken. The 14-year-old who had destroyed generations had grown into a man determined to redeem them, to extract healing from harm, and to ensure that the sacrifices of the past, Elizabeth's suffering, the hidden children, the lives warped by misguided breeding, would ultimately serve a greater purpose than the twisted vision of the covenant. Thomas Campbell, born Thomas Blackwood, carried the weight of that responsibility with a quiet determination that would guide his work for decades to come. The Macabre Case of 1927 had ended, but its legacy flowed through his veins. A reminder that the darkest family secrets sometimes held the seeds of unexpected redemption.